The year was 1867, and the Ozarks of Missouri were a place of both beauty and unease. Rolling hills stretched for miles, covered in dense woods that seemed endless to anyone traveling through. The roads were little more than dirt paths cut between trees and stone, winding and uneven, where wagon wheels often got stuck and men on horseback could vanish into the fog without a sound. Travelers usually said that the land itself felt alive, with the hush of leaves and the low calls of night animals filling the air like whispers. It was a place that could comfort you with its quiet or make you feel as though someone unseen was watching from the shadows. For those moving through the Ozarks, whether they were traders, soldiers heading home after the war, or simple families searching for land, there were few places to rest. Inns were scattered and far apart, and homesteads often sat miles away from the nearest neighbor. In that emptiness, a small house by the roadside could mean the difference between safety and despair. When a traveler saw smoke curling from a chimney, it was a promise of warmth, food, and maybe even company. But not every door in the Ozarks led to kindness. The people who lived in those hills had carved out their lives through grit and hard labor. Farming rocky soil, cutting timber, raising livestock. None of it came easy. Poverty was a constant shadow, and hunger pushed even decent men to do things they never would have dreamed of in another life. Families depended on every coin that passed into their hands, and for some, that coin was too slow in coming. There were whispers even then, quiet warnings shared around campfires and in small-town taverns. Some said that not every homestead lived up to the kind of hospitality it promised. Among the hills, there were two brothers whose names had not yet spread beyond the region. They were strong men, clever in ways. They weren't always honest, and bound together not only by blood, but by shared hardship. The war had left scars across the land, and though the battles no longer raged, the tension of those years still clung to people. Soldiers returning home found little left to claim, and neighbors looked at each other with suspicion, remembering which side they had once stood on. The brothers had learned early that survival meant more than sweat. It meant knowing when to take what was not yours, when to bend trust into something you could use. Still, to anyone passing by, they looked like simple countrymen. Their home was rough, but standing strong, with a yard that held the usual marks of farm life. Tools left leaning against the barn, a couple of animals grazing lazily in the grass, and smoke from the hearth rolling into the sky. They greeted strangers with easy smiles, offered water to the thirsty, and seemed, on the surface, like the sort of people who made the roads less lonely. But in their eyes there was something harder, a look that stayed even when their mouths were curved in welcome. Travelers who stopped there usually remembered the same small details. The cool dipper of water drawn from the well, the wooden chairs creaking under their weight, the way the brothers' voices carried a certain calm as they asked where someone was headed and whether they carried coin. Harmless questions, but in a place where people often traveled with their savings hidden in their packs. Every answer carried weight. The Ozarks were full of secrets. Some were harmless, like a family recipe or a hidden fishing spot. Others were heavier, darker, the kind you kept buried, because speaking them out loud would make them real. The brothers had their own secret, and though no one yet suspected it, their home was not the haven it seemed. A shadow hung over their doorway, a feeling hard to put into words, but one that lingered with those who left. Not all travelers, however, got the chance to leave. Before the crimes came to light, life in the hills carried on as it always had. Children helped their mothers haul water. Men worked fields and timber, and Sunday mornings filled the air with the sound of church bells echoing across the valley. Neighbors looked out for one another when sickness spread or when livestock went missing. There was a sense of community, fragile though it was, and everyone believed they knew who they could trust. Yet beneath those ordinary days, there were cracks. Poverty made men desperate. Envy crept into friendships, and the lines between right and wrong often blurred when survival was at stake. The brothers understood that better than most. They knew how to read people, their needs, their fears, their weaknesses, and they knew how to hide their own nature behind charm and hospitality. For all the ease in their voices, there was an edge to their laughter, a coldness in the silence that followed their words. It was the kind of thing that only revealed Itzy. LF, once you were already inside their world, sitting at their table, drinking what they offered in 1867, the Ozarks were still a place where law came slowly, if it came at all. Sheriffs were spread thin, and towns were often too small to hold any real authority. Justice depended on neighbors, on whispers passed from one mouth to another, on someone brave enough to question what others chose to ignore. For a long time, no one asked too many questions about the brothers' home. No one wanted to believe that something darker could hide behind such ordinary walls. But the silence would not last forever. The hills that seemed so peaceful by day would soon tell a different story. The dirt road that wound past their house, once a lifeline for weary travelers, would become a path of dread. And the brothers, who once offered water to strangers, would be remembered not for kindness, but for something else entirely. The world of the Ozarks was about to be shaken, and the whispers around campfires would no longer be ignored. The air in the Ozarks had a way of holding silence. In those years after the war, silence was both a comfort and a threat. A man could hear his own footsteps for miles, his horse's hooves echoing like drums in the stillness, and yet he could never quite shake the sense that something unseen moved with him. For the brothers, that silence was not unsettling. It was useful. It gave them cover, allowed them to weigh their choices without the world pressing in. But slowly, the stillness began to change. It grew heavy, charged, as though the hills themselves sensed what was coming. The brothers had long shared a bond, one forged in hardship and sharpened by survival. Yet bonds can turn brittle when tested too often. The war had left them restless, each carrying wounds that had no clean edges. One had returned with a scar across his face, the other with a limp that grew worse when the weather turned damp. But the wounds inside were harder to see. Both men carried anger, though it smoldered in different ways, one simmering quietly, the other flashing hot without warning. They had been taught to trust no one but each other. Yet trust is fragile when temptation creeps in. Temptation came most often in the form of money. Travelers brought it in small pouches hidden beneath coats, in satchels tied shut with fraying string, in boots where only the desperate or the careful thought to look. Sometimes the brothers caught glimpses of gold coins, the dull gleam of a wedding band, the flash of a pocket watch polished by constant handling. They knew what these things could buy: land, stock, a better roof to sleep under. But they also knew that men did not part with such treasures willingly. At first they watched, tempted but cautious, telling themselves they were only thinking, not yet deciding. But thoughts, when repeated often enough, turn into plans. The tension between them grew as their ideas of survival diverged. One brother leaned toward patience, insisting that hard work, though slow, would keep them safe. He wanted to build something that would last, a life that would not hang on whispers or threats. The other, more restless, felt the world owed them after all they had endured. He was tired of scraping by while strangers carried fortune past their very doorstep. His voice would rise in anger, fists slamming the table as he spoke of wasted chances. More than once, their arguments ended with one storming out into the yard, leaving the other seething in. The dim light of the fire. Outside pressures tighten around them, making patience harder to defend. Crops failed when storms washed through the hills, and livestock sickened without reason. Supplies in town grew more expensive as merchants looked to recover from the losses of war. Every coin seemed to vanish before it had warmed in their hands. Neighbors, too, began to whisper about them, not yet of violence, but of envy, of bitterness. People noticed how little the brothers had compared to others, how their eyes lingered too long on what they could not afford. And though no one said it openly, the sense grew that something was brewing inside that house. There were moments when the darkness in them slipped through the cracks, visible to those who paid attention. A traveler once spoke of the way one brother stared at him while he drank from the well, his gaze fixed not on the man's face, but on the purse tied at his waist. Another neighbor recalled hearing shouting from the house late at night, words muffled but filled with fury, the sound of wood breaking under strain. It was said that one of them began carrying a knife tucked into his boot at all times, not just for work, but as though expecting trouble. Their past grievances also lingered, shadows that refused to fade. Before the war, they had been known as boys who bent the rules, taking what wasn't theirs, lying when it suited them. The war had only sharpened those instincts. Rumors followed them back home, of things done in camps, of men robbed on lonely roads under cover of smoke and night. Nothing was ever proven, but the stories clung to them like mud. And in private, they fed each other these memories, convincing themselves that survival had always been about strength, about taking first before someone else took from you. The bond between them, though strong, began to shift into something darker. Jealousy crept in, not over money, but over control. Each wanted to lead, to be the one whose word carried weight. One night, as they sat at the table, the fire casting shadows across their faces, the younger accused the elder of being weak, of letting chances pass them by. The elder struck back with words of recklessness, of foolish pride that would see them both ruined. Their voices carried into the night, sharp and bitter, until finally silence fell again. But it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of two men who no longer trusted where the other might lead. As their arguments grew, so too did their plans. What began as talk of survival shifted into talk of opportunity. At first, it was only small things. The idea of keeping a traveler's coin if it were left behind, of charging more than fair for a meal or a bed. But soon those thoughts turned sharper, edged with cruelty. Why wait for luck, one argued, when luck could be made? Why watch fortune ride past when it could be stopped? The other resisted, but resistance grew weaker with each passing hardship, each empty night where their stomachs growled and the future seemed thin as smoke. The breaking point came not in a single moment, but in a series of LL ones, each more dangerous than the last. A neighbor's stray cow went missing, only for its hide to be found discarded in the woods. A traveler was seen entering their yard one evening, but by morning he was gone, his horse tied outside their barn for several more days before it too vanished. Questions were asked, but the brothers always had answers, smooth, simple, enough to quiet suspicion for a time. Yet those who looked closely saw the change in them, the way their eyes darted, the way their words grew sharper when pressed. Inside the house, the weight of their choices pressed down harder. The younger began to sleep with a pistol within reach, convinced that danger could strike at any time. The elder, though quieter, grew cold, his words clipped and final. They no longer spoke of ordinary things, no more of crops, of neighbors, of plans for the land. Their conversations circled endlessly around coin, around travelers, around what could be taken if they only had the nerve. And though they still sat side by side, still worked the land together by day, the bond between them had twisted into something harder, sharper, bound not by love, but by the crimes they had not yet committed but already carried in their hearts. The hills around them seemed to echo the change. Nights grew darker, the silence heavier. Those who passed their home felt at most that creeping sense that something waited inside. Strangers still stopped, thirsty and tired, and the brothers still offered water. But behind their smiles, tension coiled tighter, ready to snap. The road that wound through the Ozarks had always been lonely, but now it was dangerous in ways few yet understood. The breaking point was close, and the brothers, once ordinary men, shaped by war and hunger, were about to step into something that could never be undone. The night it happened was quiet, too quiet, the kind of stillness that pressed against the walls of the brothers' home until it felt suffocating. The dirt road outside stretched empty in both directions, the moon low and pale above the trees, and the only sound was the faint creak of wood as the house settled in the cool air. Inside, the fire burned low, casting long, restless shadows that moved across the rough-hewn walls like figures trying to escape. The brothers sat waiting, the tension between them thick enough to choke on. Neither spoke much. Words were no longer needed. The silence between them held all the weight of their decision. When the sound of hooves broke the stillness, they both stiffened. A lone rider, weary from the road, slowed his horse at the sight of their chimney smoke. His voice carried faintly as he called out a greeting, the kind travelers always gave when approaching strange doors in lonely places. One brother rose slowly, the other's hand tightening around the pistol hidden just out of sight. Their plan was simple, rehearsed in whispers on nights like this. Yet as the moment finally came, the air inside the house felt charged, as though even the walls understood what was about to happen. The traveler stepped inside after a warm invitation, his boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. He looked worn down, dust on his coat, eyes sunken with fatigue. The brothers offered him water, as they always did. The dipper clanked lightly against the tin cup, the sound sharp in the silence. The man drank, sighing with relief, and set his pack on the table with a trust that would be his undoing. One brother sat across from him, his smile steady, his voice low and calm as he asked the usual questions. Where was he headed? How far had he come? Did he carry coin for supplies? The other moved behind him, silent, each step a measure of restraint. The air grew heavier with every passing second. The traveler spoke with ease, unaware that each word sealed his fate. He reached into his coat for a pouch of tobacco, and the faint jingle of coins inside made one brother's eyes narrow. That sound tipped the balance. There was no turning back now. The younger gave the signal with the smallest flick of his hand, and in the next heartbeat, everything broke open. The pistol cracked, loud and violent, shattering the quiet night. The traveler jerked, his eyes wide with shock, the cup slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor, spilling water across the boards. Blood followed, dark and sudden, staining the wood beneath his chair. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, sharp and bitter, mixing with the iron tang of blood. For a moment, everything seemed frozen. The fire's glow flickering against faces twisted with rage, fear, and disbelief. The elder brother stood motionless, his chest heaving, his ears ringing from the shot. He had not expected it to happen so fast, had not expected the sound of it to echo so loudly in his own skull. The younger man, still wrapped around the pistol, stared at the man crumpled before him with eyes that looked both wild and empty. For all the planning, for all the talk, the reality was raw and ugly in a way neither had truly imagined. The traveler gasped, his hands fumbling weakly against the wound as though he could hold his life in with his bare fingers. His lips moved, forming words that never came, eyes searching for mercy in faces that offered none. One brother stepped forward, his jaw tight, muttering that it had to be done, that they couldn't stop now. The other hesitated, a flicker of something human stirring in his chest. Regret, fear, the sudden, crushing weight of what they had done. But hesitation was a dangerous thing, and the younger cut through it with another violent act. The knife flashed, quick and final, and the traveler's body went still. The silence that followed was unbearable. Only the crackle of the fire remained, and the low, wet sound of blood dripping onto the floorboards. Both men stood breathing hard, staring at the still figure before them as though unsure it was real. The elder finally sank into a chair, his face pale, his hands shaking. The younger began pacing, muttering under his breath, his words tumbling over each other. It was necessary. No one would ever know. This was survival. But beneath the surface of his words was panic. The body at their feet was no longer a man, but a problem that needed to be solved. The elder finally forced himself to move, kneeling by the dead traveler, avoiding the lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. Together, they lifted the body, its weight awkward and heavy, dragging it across the floor, leaving Stria. Chaos behind. Every sound, the scrape of boots, the thud of the man's arm against the wall, seemed impossibly loud, echoing through the night as though the hills themselves were listening. They worked in frantic silence, the smell of blood clinging to their hands, to their clothes. One fetched a shovel, the other carried the pack that had started it all. They didn't dare open it yet. Greed had driven them here, but for the moment, fear ruled every movement. Out in the yard, the earth was hard, but they dug anyway, their hands blistering, sweat soaking their shirts despite the cool air. Every strike of the shovel into the ground rang out like a bell, a tolling that seemed to mark them forever. When at last the body was hidden beneath the soil, they stood staring down at the disturbed earth, their breathing ragged, their clothes streaked with mud and blood. The younger was the first to turn away, already thinking of the coins of what could now be theirs. The elder lingered, his gaze fixed on the patch of ground as though it might rise up and accuse him. His chest ached with the weight of what they had done, with the knowledge that there was no going back. Inside the house, they tried to erase the traces, scrubbing at the boards, scattering ash from the hearth to soak up what remained. But blood has a way of clinging, of seeping into the cracks, leaving marks no amount of scrubbing can fully erase. The smell lingered, sharp and metallic, no matter how much water they poured across the floor. Every stain became a reminder, every shadow a threat. When they finally sat at the table again, the pack lay between them. Inside were coins, a watch, a few personal keepsakes, things that should have felt like triumph, like the reward for their risk. But as the elder stared at them, he saw only blood. His brother's eyes gleamed with hunger, but behind the hunger was something darker, a wildness that unsettled him. They had crossed a line together, but each felt it differently. For one, it was survival. For the other, it was a wound that would never heal. That night, the hills of the Ozarks held their secret, the road outside once again falling silent. But the silence was different now, heavier, charged with what had been done. A man had vanished into the soil, and the brothers' lives had changed forever. The crime was done, but its shadow had only begun to spread in the days that followed. The brothers lived as though under a curse. The silence of their house, once an ally, now pressed down on them with unbearable weight. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the shutters felt like an accusation. The elder brother found himself waking in the dark, heart pounding, certain he could hear footsteps outside the window or a faint voice calling from beneath the soil. He would sit upright in bed, drenched in sweat, staring into the shadows until dawn finally broke. The younger slept more deeply, but even in his dreams, he was restless, muttering, twitching, his hand reaching for the pistol he kept close. First, they clung to denial. The younger said again and again that it had been necessary, that no one would ever know. He convinced himself that the traveler had been just another face on the road, one who would not be missed. But when the elder tried to believe it, his mind would betray him. He saw the man's eyes staring up at him in the dirt, his lips moving in those final moments. He couldn't stop laying it. How quickly life had left, how final it had been. No matter how many times he washed his hands, the smell of iron seemed to cling to them. The community around them began to notice changes. The brothers grew short-tempered, their voices sharp where once they had been merely gruff. They avoided neighbors more often, turning away from conversation, their eyes darting as though they feared every question hid suspicion. When travelers passed by, fewer were welcomed in, and those who did stay never stayed long. Some said the house felt different, colder, as though a shadow had settled over it. The same chairs were at the table, the same smoke curled from the chimney, yet something unseen had shifted, and people could sense it. Rumors began quietly. A man had gone missing on the road. His horse was seen days later, wandering riderless near the trees. Another traveler was never heard from again after passing through that part of the hills. Neighbors traded glances, speaking in lowered voices about what they had noticed. The strange digging at night, the way the brothers' yard always seemed disturbed, as if freshly turned earth lay beneath the grass. But no one wanted to accuse outright. In places like the Ozarks, suspicion could be dangerous if it was misplaced. Still, unease spread, carried on whispers in town and murmurs outside the church. The elder brother felt the weight of it most. He grew withdrawn, his eyes hollow, his face lined with a tiredness that seemed to age him beyond his years. He stopped laughing, stopped speaking much at all, as though each word risked exposing what lay buried in his chest. His guilt gnawed at him, stripping him down bit by bit. The younger, on the other hand, leaned into denial and justification. He spoke of survival, of how the world had always been cruel, how no one had ever handed them anything but hardship. He said what they had done was no worse than what soldiers had done in the war. To him, the crime was not a burden, but a tool, proof that they could take what they needed if they had the courage. But courage has a way of turning into recklessness. The younger grew bolder, less careful, as though daring the world to catch up with him. He carried himself with a swagger that unsettled those who knew him, boasting of better days to come without ever explaining how. He began to look at every traveler not as a guest, but as an opportunity. The elder watched him with dread, knowing each risk made discovery more certain. Their bond, once so strong, now frayed under the weight of fear and distrust. For the wider community, the disappearances became too many to ignore. Families wrote letters, searching for loved ones who had vanished on the road. Merchants spoke of customers who had promised to return but never did. Slowly, a pattern emerged, one that pointed to the brothers' home with chilling clarity. Yet even as suspicion grew, people hesitated to act. To accuse meant to face the possibility that such horror had lived right among them, behind a door they themselves had once knocked on. It was easier for a time to look away, to convince themselves there might be another explanation. The toll of the crime reached beyond the brothers and the missing travelers. Wives waited for husbands who never returned. Children grew up without fathers, and families lived with questions that had no answers. In the small towns nearby, people grew wary, afraid to walk the roads alone, glancing over their shoulders at every sound. What had once been a landscape of peace and endurance now seemed tainted, each shadowed grove and winding path holding the possibility of danger. Trust, once a fragile but living bond, began to rot. Inside the brothers' home, the atmosphere was one of decay. Meals were eaten in silence, the clatter of forks and spoons the only sound. The fire no longer felt warm. Its glow only deepened the hollows under their eyes. The elder began drinking heavily, trying to dethrone the images that haunted him, but the drink only brought nightmares sharper than before. The younger pressed forward, cold and determined, but even he could not fully escape the cracks forming inside him. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, he would wake with his heart racing, convinced he had heard the traveler's voice outside, calling his name. The land itself seemed to remember. The patches of disturbed earth never blended fully back into the yard, no matter how carefully they tried. Rain left the soil uneven, darker, as though it refused to keep its secret buried. Birds avoided the area, their songs falling silent when they drew near. To outsiders, it might have been nothing more than imagination, but to the brothers, it was a constant reminder. Every time they stepped outside, they were confronted by the weight of what lay beneath their feet. As the months passed, whispers turned to certainty. More eyes began to watch them, and more questions were asked that they could not easily answer. The law in those hills was slow, often reluctant, but it was not blind. When the stories of missing men and unanswered letters piled too high to ignore, attention turned firmly toward the brothers' home. And though they tried to carry on as though nothing had changed, both knew in their bones that their time was running short. The crime that had once seemed like a single desperate act had grown into something far larger than they ever intended. It had left wounds across families, distrust in the community, and shadows over their own souls. For the elder, it was a slow death of the spirit, a weight he could not cast off. For the younger, it was a fight to maintain his denial, his justifications chipping away each time another question was asked. The Ozarks held their silence, but it was no longer the silence of peace. It was the silence of waiting, for truth to surface, for justice to stir, for the fragile calm of the hills to break open once again. When the truth finally surfaced, it did not come as a sudden shock, but as a slow unraveling, like a knot pulled loose strand by strand. Neighbors had whispered long enough, travelers had vanished too often, and the law, though slow in the Ozarks, could no longer turn its face away. Search parties moved into the hills, men with shovels and lanterns, guided by stories of missing horses, disturbed earth, and uneasy silences around the brothers' land. What they found beneath the soil was enough to shatter whatever peace remained. The ground gave up its secrets, one by one, and with each body uncovered, the weight of the brothers' crimes grew impossible to deny. The arrest came without violence. Perhaps by then, the brothers knew resistance was pointless. The elder hung his head, his hands trembling as the sheriff bound them with rope. The younger kept his chin high, his eyes still flashing with defiance, as though he could will the world to believe his justifications. Yet in the eyes of those gathered, neighbors, townsfolk, even the families of the missing, there was no sympathy left. Whatever masks the brothers had once worn had been torn away. They were no longer men of the hills, but killers, stripped bare in front of all who had once trusted them. The trial that followed was unlike anything the community had seen before. Word of the crimes spread far beyond the Ozarks, drawing strangers who came to hear the grisly details. Newspapers printed stories filled with outrage and disbelief, painting the brothers as monsters who had hidden in plain sight. In the courthouse, families of the missing sat with hollow faces, listening as evidence was laid out. The stolen goods, the bloodstains that could not be scrubbed away. The testimonies of those who had sensed something was wrong, but had stayed silent for too long. The elder brother spoke little during the proceedings. When he did, his words carried the weight of exhaustion more than defense. He admitted regret, though whether it was for the lives taken or for his own downfall was never clear. The younger, in contrast, argued fiercely, insisting on survival, insisting the war had made them this way, insisting the world was cruel and they had only matched its cruelty. His voice rang with bitterness, but no amount of anger could shift the verdict. The jury returned swiftly, their decision carrying both justice and finality. The sentence was death. In those days, punishment was as much about setting an example as it was about law, and the community demanded nothing less. The executions were carried out in the open, a grim ritual meant to show that even in the most remote corners of the hills, justice had its reach. The elder faced his end with quiet resignation, eyes lowered, lips moving in silent prayer. The younger went with fury still burning, shouting curses until the final moment. And then the silence of the Ozarks closed over them, heavy and final. Yet justice, though served in law, did not erase the damage left behind. Families still carried their grief, their lives permanently marked by the absence of husbands, sons, and fathers who had vanished on the road. The community itself was changed. Trust, once fragile but present, was now broken in ways that could not easily be mended. Neighbors looked at each other differently, suspicion lingering in even the smallest gestures. Hospitality, once a proud tradition in the hills, grew hesitant. Strangers were no longer welcomed with the same warmth, for fear of what kindness might conceal. The case left its mark on the wider world as well. The newspapers' lurid accounts fed the public's fascination with crime, but they also stirred debate about morality, justice, and the thin line between survival and cruelty. The brothers' story was told not just as a tale of murder, but as a reflection of a society scarred by war and poverty, where desperation could twist men into something unrecognizable. It raised questions that lingered long after the hangings. Questions about how much responsibility lies with the individual and how much with the world that shapes him. Looking back, the story of the brothers was more than just a tale of a crime. It was a study of human nature at its breaking point. It showed how power, when unchecked, can turn against the very bonds it was meant to protect. It revealed how morality bends under the weight of hunger, anger, and envy, and how easy it is for men to justify the unforgivable when they believe they have no other choice. And it reminded the community that evil does not always come in the form of strangers. Sometimes it wears the face of a neighbor, a smile offered at the door, a dipper of water extended with what seems like kindness. In the end, the brothers' lives ended as they had lived, bound to each other, caught in the grip of choices they could never undo. The elder, broken by guilt, seemed almost relieved to meet his end. The younger, defiant to the last, carried his rage like a banner, unwilling to surrender even as the noose closed. Both were claimed by the justice of their time, but their story lived on, a shadow over the hills and a warning to those who came after. The Ozarks healed slowly, but never completely. The dirt roads remained, winding through the same woods and fields, but travelers now rode with sharper eyes, listening closely to the silence that surrounded them. The story of the brothers became part of that silence, a whispered memory carried in the wind through the trees, reminding all who heard it of how quickly trust can turn to betrayal, and how even the most ordinary lies can hide the darkest of truths.